British Prime Minister David Cameron has called for an inquiry into claims that UK intelligence agents extradited terror suspects to Libya. The allegations surfaced after human rights groups in Tripoli found documents outlining MI6 and CIA rendition programs. Well, now let's go live to Germany to talk to Annie Maschen. She's a former British intelligence officer. Annie, can you hear me there?
I can indeed.
Great, thanks very much indeed for joining us there in Germany. Now, one of the Libyan rebel commanders who's now in charge of military forces in Tripoli wants an apology from London and Washington for handing him over to Gaddafi back in 2004. Is he likely to get it?
I'm sure there'll be some sort of whitewash. I mean, when David Cameron calls for an inquiry into these allegations, he's being incredibly disingenuous. Under the UK law, the Inquiries Act 2005, any inquiry that is established, including this torture inquiry headed up by Sir Peter Gibson, is circumscribed by the very organisations that are being investigated, in this case MI5 and MI6. So it's going to be toothless. Plus, of course, the other consideration with this is that Sir Peter Gibson himself, who's heading up this inquiry, was actually the Intelligence Services Commissioner for 5 years prior to taking on this role. So he's been cozying up to the intelligence services in the UK for 5 years. I doubt if he's going to unearth anything deliberately, perhaps. He probably won't shine a bright light in the dark corners, shall we say. He'll be friends to the intelligence agencies.
But nevertheless, we're seeing David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, being really outspoken about this, saying that, you know, he wants to make sure this inquiry does go ahead and get the truth. Now, obviously, his government wasn't in office when this allegedly was going on. So how do you rate his moves? Is it a decent call to reveal the truth, or is it just simply dishing the dirt on the previous government?
Well, it would be lovely to think it was a decent call, but actually the whole dreadful dance between the UK particularly and the rest of the West and Libya has been going on for decades. So both Tory and Labour Party governments have been implicated in this. And I think, in fact, the UK has stirred up a perfect storm in its relationships with relationship with Libya. And it's created problems which are going to go on for years now, not just for the UK itself, but also for the NATO forces already there. So we're looking, for example, at a morally dubious war. We're looking at the funding of the LIFG, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, of which this man was a member, which had al-Qaeda links for many years. And it was funded by MI6, certainly up to the 1990s, and has been backed during this rebellion. And we're also looking at issues such as torture and extraordinary renditions. So all of the most dubious practices which have resulted from the war on terror seem to be coming to a sort of nexus point with Libya.
But as a former intelligence officer, does this not surprise you? I mean, if this is in the interests of national security, as they're saying, that they're working together, the two countries at that time, on tackling Islamic terrorists, in the interests of national security, that is justifiable, isn't it?
Well, what is national security? That's the very basic question. And quite often we find that certain governmental or class or business interests are deemed to be national security. So, for example, the idea of trying to exert retribution against Colonel Gaddafi for his booting out, his expulsion from Libya after he seized power of the oil industries, that's partly why he became pariah number one. Of course, he then funded a number of terrorist organisations. But then, of course, once they were invited back in, because of machinations and behind-the-scenes negotiations between Gaddafi's regime and Musa Kusa, his intelligence head, and the former government, and MI6 as well, Sir Mark Allen, who's now got a very lucrative post at BP, suddenly we're seeing that a sort of switch backwards and forwards between who is our friend. And we have a problem with this because historically you can cozy up to one side and then you can cozy up to the other, but if you then betray those sides, you end up with both sides hating you. And that's precisely the situation we're in now. I mean, they victimised Gaddafi, they made him number one pariah for 3 decades, then they cozied up to him for 5-10 years, and suddenly they're hunting him again. And it's a very morally dubious, ethically dubious, but also practically a not very effective approach that they have adhered to over the last few decades of the West.
Just very briefly, talking about that switch in allegiance and the way loyalties change, what about the Libyan people actually allegedly killed by Gaddafi loyalists over the last 6 months? Is it actually possible that some of them were brought to the Colonel's attention by the work of British and American intelligence?
Well, quite possibly. I mean, the hideous irony is, of course, that NATO is supposed to go in to protect civilians, and yet both sides have been killing civilians, as far as I can see, and torturing civilians and things. So, it's the poor people that are suffering. And there have to be questions asked, of course, as well. As this new government comes in, I mean, it is being reported that, for example, they're going to base the new constitution partly on Sharia law. And of course, Libya has been for decades very friendly, very open, very sort of egalitarian when it came to a woman's place in their society. So suddenly they might be feeling a lot more repression.
Just briefly and finally, very embarrassing though for the British government and damaging perhaps?
Totally, yes. I mean, they will have lost all credibility. They have double-dealed in Libya for decades now, and really their chickens are coming home to roost, and I can't see how any government that comes into power in Libya will trust whatever MI6 or the British government now says. OK, thanks very much, Annie. Good to hear from you. Live from Düsseldorf, Germany, that was former British intelligence officer Annie Maschen joining us live there.